Hey, my name's Nick. Today we're going to look at some of the most common yoga poses done incorrectly. These are all poses you typically find in a beginner or all-level yoga class, and there is almost always some kind of issue with alignment or engagement. So we'll talk about what they are and what you can do to improve them. But before we get started, don't forget to like and subscribe, leave a comment, let me know what you think. All right, starting with number one, plank or Palankasana and Chaturanga Dandasana. Yes, they are different poses, but I'm putting them together because I see the same mistakes in both of them, and if you're doing this in plank, then there is a good chance it's happening in Chaturanga too. The two things. I'm looking for shoulder stability and core engagement. These are usually where new and even intermediate students go wrong. If I see the shoulders shrugging up towards the ears, rounding over the top of the rib cage, I'm probably not going to ask them to move on to Chaturanga until I can see that the shoulder blades are sitting down the back and stable. Without shoulder stability, the hands end up way too close to the shoulders, the shoulder blades wing away from the back. You end up relying on the integrity of the shoulder joint instead of muscular strength in the shoulders like you should. Similarly, if the core isn't engaged in plank, if I see the hips above or below the line between the shoulders and the feet, I'm not going to ask someone to try lowering down into Chaturanga. Lowering down, the hips and the shoulders ideally move as a single unit. Without core engagement, the hips are likely to stay up above the rest of the body, and it really diminishes the effectiveness of this movement. So, for both plank and Chaturanga, shoulders back and down. When you're lowering down the torso, moving as a single unit. Try this. Touch your shoulders and chicken wing out, around, and down. Keep your elbows in at your sides and reach the forearms perpendicular to the torso. These are Chaturanga arms. When lowering down, pull the belly into the spine and reach the chest forward so you can find those 90-degree arms. If you can't, or you can't do this with the legs straight, it's totally fine to put the knees on the ground, put your hands on blocks, practice at a table, but don't believe what you've been told. This knees, chest, chin thing is not a useful modification or a substitute for Chaturanga. All right, number two, downward facing dog or Adho Mukha Svanasana. Downward facing dog shows up in nearly every single yoga class. It's a great pose to practice, and it's almost always got something going on with it. The common misalignments I usually see pretty much boil down to two things: pelvic rotation and spinal extension. What does that mean? It's just anatomical gibberish. Here we go. Pelvic rotation. We want to see anterior pelvic rotation. That's cow pose hips, tailbone lifting up into the air. But when beginners practice downward facing dog, they often start with the assumption that the heels need to stay on the ground. If they have tight hamstrings, this pulls the hips into posterior rotation. So you hear this a lot. It's fine to bend your knees in downward facing dog, and it totally is. But the reason to bend the knees is in order to provide more space to rotate the hips forward, and that crucial part doesn't always make it through. The next thing I look for is thoracic extension. That is back bending a bit in the chest and the ribs. One of the purposes of bringing the arms overhead is to provide leverage to extend through the middle of the back. So you might hear this cue occasionally: push your chest towards the floor, or push your chest towards the knees, or something to indicate reaching through the chest. The problem is that the shoulders are part of our lever arm, and they are usually a lot more mobile than the chest. So when we reach the chest, what ends up happening is we increase shoulder flexion. So to extend through the chest, first engage the shoulders into lateral rotation. I like to start this in a table pose and try to point the soft part of the elbow forward, and then to keep them pointing forward as much as possible when lifting into downward facing dog. Now we have a very strong lever that won't collapse at the shoulders when we try to extend through the spine. We can do it more effectively. All right, number three. Upward facing dog. Everyone's favorite pose to breeze through on the way to down dog. Why doesn't Urdhva Mukha Svanasana get more love? I once taught a class where we held up dog as much as down dog, and the reason, it turns out, is that because up dog is so hard for beginners and even intermediate students to get right that it almost needs its own workshop. The two most common corrections I give are keeping the knees and the hips up off the ground, and also keeping the shoulders down the back. The thing that I think a lot of people miss about up dog is that it is essentially an arm balance. I mean, yes, it has back bending parts, but the weight of the body is resting down on the arms like in Talasana, and it requires a lot of downward pushing strength. If you don't have the strength, then of course your knees and your hips are going to drop, your shoulders are going to shrug up towards the ears. To improve on upward facing dog, before even attempting it, really, I recommend having a very strong parallel support pose, building shoulder strength before even trying to add the back bending element. So try this. Set your hands on blocks and lift your hips up off the ground. Keep the shoulders down and back and work up to holding for at least 30 seconds. And then when you have strong shoulders, come back and practice up dog. All right, number 4, Utkatasana, chair pose. Utkatasana is such a wonderful pose. So many special and diverse ways it can go wrong. It's kind of like the canary in the coal mine for other postural imbalances. So let's look at the correct form for Utkatasana and see where it usually goes off the rails. Set up your feet hip distance apart and the knees and toes pointing forward. You don't need to keep your feet or your legs together. If you have narrow hips, they might be touching, but it's fine if they're not. Hip distance. And if you want to keep that hip distance, you want to keep it as you bend the knees. The tendency is for the toes to splay out or for the knees to shift in. Don't. We're also trying to maintain a neutral pelvis. This means that the front points of the hips and the back points of the hips are within an inch of parallel. If you settle your waistband or even a strap around the crest of your hips, you might have an easier time seeing this in the mirror. The tendency is for the pelvis to rotate forward as you bend the knees. If you keep the core engaged by drawing the navel in, you can better control this. And the last common alignment I see is too much forward leaning. This can be for different reasons: lack of mobility at the ankle or the hips, or lack of strength at the quadriceps. We're looking for the torso to remain parallel with the shins. So let the knees bend over the toes. If that's challenging, you might try putting a rolled up blanket or something underneath your heels to assist there. And number 5, another standing pose that almost nobody gets right the first time is pyramid pose, or Parsvottanasana. I almost always see Parsvottanasana with hips canted to the side. Why? Well, it's easier to do that way. So check yourself. Slide a hand to the back of your hips. If you couldn't balance a cup of chai on the back of your hips, then lean your weight forward until your hips are more square. If you need to come up, put your hands on blocks, do that. If you need to bend the front knee, do that. But prioritize squaring your hips. You'll do a better job of targeting the hamstrings for this stretch. And finally, number 6, rounding out this list with core work. Yes, I'm going to lump it all together, specifically supine and seated core work. We're talking crunches, bicycles, seated twists, leg lifts, all of it. They're all getting thrown together because I see the same fundamental mistake in almost all of them. Namely, trying to approximate a movement by moving the limbs or the head instead of actually engaging the core. The abdominal muscles attached to the ribs and to the pelvis. When they contract and shorten, the trunk flexes. All of the other stuff with the arms and legs is just for balance or for leverage. And these could all be great core exercises, but unless the movements originate from the core, they're entirely useless. So, twists and bicycles, for example, movements that use the arms, set the arms in place, and keep them there. If you're not sure what that feels like, then bring the palms to the chest and try doing the movement without letting your thumbs move away from the center of the chest. Keep them there. For crunches and sit-ups, hold the head in place. Find 1 finger's distance between the chin and the collarbones and keep it there. You'll be lifting from the core and not from the neck. For leg lifts, continue lifting until you lift the hips off of the ground. No desperate swinging or anything like that. Push your low back into the floor, feel the core engage, and control the lift. All right, so there it is. 6 poses or groups of poses that beginners often get wrong. Leave any thoughts or questions in the comments, and until then, enjoy your practice.